David. Seventh, sorry. I am a little bit unclear on that myself because I haven't been here for any of the previous sermons in this particular series, which is a risk. Obviously, it's a risk that I will be repetitive, and it's a risk that I will be contradictory. So let's see how we get on with this today. But today's topic is all about life within limits, and it feels a little bit kind of appropriate, I suppose, for... Sorry, this feels like it's attacking me. It feels a little bit appropriate for the situation I found myself in over the last few weeks, because I've found myself very, very tight on time, which is one reason why I haven't been here. Well, I've been here once in the last 6 weeks. That was 2 weeks ago, and we were preaching about something different. So hence the fact that I've kind of missed the flow a little bit of this series. And then there's been good things going on. It's not that there've been bad things. It's been very nice. Last Sunday I went to Wimbledon with my mum, which was tremendous. The 2 days before that I went camping with Dan. The week before that I was here. The week before that I took Zach to a football tournament. The week before that I took Dan to a football tournament. 2 days before that I took Anna camping. The week before that I was in Perth, as in Perth, Australia, rather than Perth, Scotland, going to Singapore. And the week before that I was going from my brothers in Nottingham to Heathrow to fly to Singapore to get to Perth. So, you know, there's been lots of things going on. And the topic today is about life within limits. And for me, it's felt that limit recently has been time. There's not been vast amounts of it. But for other people, obviously, there are various other limits that we experience in life. There are physical limitations that people will have experienced, or financial limitations, or all types of other things. And today we are specifically looking at David and effectively, his life on the run and the limitations that put on him. And we get to see his reaction to that as well. So we read the first bit of the story in 1 Samuel 19, which is someone else looking into his story and telling us what happened. And then we look at Psalm 57, which is kind of his reaction to the story. How's he processing it? What's he doing? How's he reacting? And we'll go into that in a bit more detail. But first, we're going to just rewind a little bit and just set this in a little bit of context. And I say, apologies as if this is repetitive, because someone may have done this already, but I think it's quite helpful just to kind of set things in the overall scheme. So we're in the book of Samuel, and Samuel is a very dramatic story. It has some of the very striking biblical characters, all of whom appear actually, well, apart from Samuel, directly in today's passage. So there's Samuel himself, prophet. There's King Saul. And then there's David, but there's all these supporting characters as well, this supporting cast, so people like Hannah and Jonathan and Eli and various other people. And it's interesting, I think, and it happens a lot in the Old Testament, that they look like stories of political power, like political machinations and developments going on. But actually, it's fundamentally about the power of God, and God acting in and through different personalities and different events to bring Israel to a future in keeping with God's purposes. So you might remember that where the story of King Saul starts is that Israel say, we really want a king. And I don't know if anyone remembers what God's reaction to that is. Well, no you don't. And they say, Israel go, no, but everyone else has got one. We want one too. And God says, no, really, you don't want a king. And they go through this, and after a while God says, okay, if you want a king, I'll give you a king. Okay, and that king is King Saul. But it becomes pretty clear quite quickly that Saul isn't going to last for very long in this particular job. He's not very well suited to it. He also gets these really bad tempers. There's talk of evil spirits coming on him. And so God decides, okay, we're going to need someone else to take this job. And Samuel's job is to go out and anoint a new king, find a new king. And that isn't someone to take over the job straight away. It's someone who's going to take that job in the future, someone to identify someone who will become king. And you'll remember the story. Samuel goes out to what's a pretty obscure family, pretty unknown family in Israel, and says, "Can I look at all your boys, please? Show me your sons." And Jesse parades 7 sons in front of him, and Samuel goes through and he's praying and he's thinking about it and going, "No, no, 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 no. Haven't you got anyone else? Is this all you've got?" And Jesse said, "Well, I've got one more." But, he's a kid and he's looking after the sheep, which is presumably the artwork we've got here. And he brings David over, and Samuel goes, "Yeah, that's the guy. That's the guy. He is the one I will anoint to become king." And as I say, he doesn't take up the job straight away. That's for his future. That's for further off. But that is his purpose. That's where he's now headed. And then where the story goes in Samuel from there is that we remember David and Goliath. And David obviously slays this enormous giant from the Philistine army. And there are other battles which are described. And David becomes wildly popular within Israel. Wildly popular, except with one person. And that one person is Saul himself. And why is Saul upset? Because he's worried. I don't think he can't know, presumably, that David's been anointed to be his successor, but he can see politically where this one's going. You've got someone who's incredibly popular, incredibly successful, wins every battle. People start singing nasty songs about how David kills more people than Saul, and that type of thing. But it's obvious what people think. And it then takes us to where we are in this chapter. And it's pretty clear that Saul doesn't like David at all. And do you remember where the chapter opens up? And thank you, Joyce, for reading the whole lot. That was quite a big chunk. Just at the start of that chapter, pretty clear where this is going. Yeah, exactly. He's not even pretending anymore, is he? He's saying, "No, I just want to kill him. Yep, let's just go off and kill this guy." And we'll go into that in a little bit more. And then after this chapter, David, well, he's on the run in this chapter. He continues to go on the run over the next few chapters. I think it's by about chapter 22, 23, he's hiding in a cave. And if you look at the bit at the top of Psalm 57, he talks about him being in a cave. So that's where our 2 passages come together. Life gets a bit weird for David. At one point in Samuel 21, he has to pretend to be crazy in order to be able to save himself. And eventually Saul dies in battle. His son Jonathan dies in battle, and David becomes king. So it's a remarkable story of life on the run, or as you might want to call it, liars and liars, which I'll explain a little bit in a minute. So the chapter that we have today, 1 Samuel 19, has got, I think, in it a few different escapes. How many escapes did people count? Or maybe just if you've seen any escapes there in 1 Samuel 19, just call them out and then see if we've got the same list. David climbing out the window. Yep, that's an escape. Jonathan warns David. Yeah, another escape. I counted 4. I might be slightly, generous with my description of escape. So the first one is that Saul is quite open about the fact he wants to kill David, and he talks to Jonathan, which feels like a slightly odd move, given that David and Jonathan are best friends. But Jonathan is also Saul's son, so it makes sense from that perspective. And Jonathan talks him down and says, "Don't kill David," and Jonathan also warns David about all of this. So that's your first escape. I think it's also your first lie, because Saul says at the end of it, "Okay, I promise, I swear, I'm not going to try and kill the guy," and then of course try something completely different. Escape number 2 in this passage. So David then goes to war against the Philistines again, and it goes really well again, and something goes wrong with Saul again, and an evil spirit, it says, comes from the Lord. And what happens at that point? Saul tries to stab him. Saul throws a spear, and David dodges it. That to me feels like another little of escape from death at that particular point. So that's my second one. Then the third one, David's wife, who brilliantly is also Saul's daughter, let's not forget. David's wife says, "You've got to get out of here. He's going to kill you." And she pulls like a trick from a film in the 1980s, where she lies out what is supposed to look like a body in the bed with goat's hair and an idol. I won't dwell on that bit, but why has David got an idol in his house? Maybe not as, perfect in all respects. And says, he's sleeping in the bed. He's kind of like dressed up a model in the bed. And then she lets him out, and he escapes. And then the soldiers come up and say, "Why did you do that?" She said, he threatened to kill me. Another lie. That is also not true in these circumstances. And then the fourth escape is that David has run off, and Saul is after him. And he sends soldiers first, and eventually Saul himself goes after him. And what happens in that circumstance? There's some kind of spiritual intervention, and which prevents Saul from killing David. So it's a remarkable set of events. And I don't know about you, but when you read some of these stories, you find it a bit difficult to relate to. It's dramatic. It's almost comedic in some senses. But there are some parts of this which I think are actually oddly a bit easier to relate to than some other things. We've got the Lord's anointed here. That's why I started with the background. David is the Lord's anointed to become king. He's not immune from difficulties. He's not immune from threats. He's not immune from attacks on his life. And to some extent, these stories, or particularly the first three escapes, are a bit more relatable than other things. You think about the miracles in the Bible involving Moses or Elijah and Jesus. Very often they're about kind of suspending the laws of nature, aren't they? So Moses parting the Red Sea, the plagues coming in Egypt, Jesus healing people miraculously, feeding of the 5,000, those types of things. Whereas here it seems to be God working through very practical circumstances, very kind of physical, obvious things. David dodging a spear, having the wisdom or the insight to be able to react in the right way in a particular situation. Someone helping him escape, taking a risk, being courageous and bold. Those are God working through everyday circumstances and everyday life. And in that sense, I think this is actually relatable. And it's also about God working through our limitations. That's our topic today. And the sense of, some of these limitations are innate. They're just what we're like to some extent. Some of the things we carry with us. And some of the things are attacks from the outside. And David experiencing a lot from the outside, but some of this will be on the inside as well. And he's got all these human frailties. So, as I mentioned earlier on, 1 Samuel 19 is all about someone narrating the story, telling the story. Psalm 57 is to a certain extent David's side of the story. How does he deal with this? And as I say, it's based in the cave, so it's about 2 or 3 chapters further on, but it's all about this scene where he's on the run and someone's after him and he's in fear for his life. So what do we get from this Psalm 57? Well, there are 4 things that I want to look at, and they're on the slide there. So the first is refuge and protection, and specifically David saying, Lord, I'm under your protection, taking refuge in you. The second thing, holding on to purpose. Remember, David is the anointed king. He's not supposed to die at this stage. That's not how this story is supposed to end. He's got something bigger and better coming. The third thing, finding this sense and retaining a sense of perspective. Now, where everything around you is going wrong, seemingly, but being able to hold on to truth and hold on to something. And the fourth thing, there's a bit at the end of the psalm we'll talk about. It's almost like, pull yourself together, David. Let's get going. And this isn't about denial. There are some things in life we really need to deal with and dig into. But equally, sometimes there's a place for saying, come on, you just need to pull yourself together and get on with it. So the first of those, refuge and protection. And I'm going back to the first verse here, which is on the slide. So have mercy on me, my God. Have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. This sense that everything is going wrong for David. I mean, we've only read one of the 3 or 4 chapters on the run, and they've tried to kill him 4 times already. I mean, this is pretty tough times. And he's saying, I'm going to take refuge in the Lord. I'm going to take shelter under your wings. And there's this nice little video which I found, which I hope it's not too light in here for us to see, if George and Kajol are able to stick it up. This is a rainstorm. Oh, it's gone. This is a rainstorm in India, very heavy rain in India. And it's a picture of a mother hen, I don't know if you can see it here, sheltering her chicks under her wings and just protecting them. You know, this great idea of it. It's a literal storm, and they're not really equipped to deal with what's coming upon them. And stoically, the mother hen is just sat there, covering them, literally covering them in the shelter of her wings. And I think that's a lovely picture of the type of thing we're talking about here, of just storm and rain and things coming in from all sides. And God just saying, just hide under my wings. Hide under my wings. I will protect you. And David finding that. And I think there's an aspect to this as well where we can do that for other people, that God can work through us so we do that for other people. I've had a few things at work where people come to me with very, very difficult personal situations, and they find themselves, clients generally, and they find themselves exposed and they don't know what to do. And occasionally I find myself saying this kind of thing. It's like, don't worry, this is our problem now. You know, hand this over to us. That's what we're here for. This is our problem now. And I think sometimes God is saying that to us. You know, this is my problem now, okay? You can share your yoke and your burden with me. And sometimes we're called to do that for each other and support each other. And so God working through the family, working through the community. So that was the first one. The second one is holding on to this sense of purpose. And it comes from verse 2, and I should say that the translations differ slightly, but this is this idea of purpose comes through in most of them, particularly if you read the Amplified Bible. So I cry to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. So holding on to this sense of purpose, which keeps him going. And I was thinking about this in the context of my parents. My dad's just written a book about his life, and his and my mum's life, particularly in the early 70s, moving on from that period when they became Christians and they became filled with the Spirit and the gifts of the Spirit, and they got baptized as adults. All of that actually led to them being kicked out of the Methodist Church and having to set up a church of their own, but that's a different story for another day. But they, at their baptism, they were given a word of knowledge. So someone felt that God had given them a clear word into their lives. And the word was this. He said, I believe that your home will be used for the ingathering of souls and the spreading of nets. And they took that word, and there was another couple who they were friendly with and a couple of other people, and they had this vision of having what they called an open Christian home. So a house church in the truest sense of the word, where they were going to come together and live in community and invite people to come in and out of their homes so they could see healing, see restoration, and see a community grow and build. Of course, the problem then is you have to buy the house. And they spent 2 years praying for that, holding on to this idea of purpose and vision to try and find a house. And a house came up in the town where they lived at the time, which they now live in again. And it was called Elmfield. And the problem, they found Elmfield, they thought it was going to be absolutely ideal for us. Problem was someone else wanted to buy it. So they went to see this guy and said, we know you've had an offer accepted on Elmfield, but do you really want it? Because we'd really like it more. And he said, yeah, I do. But he said, but there's another house down the road called Merrifield House, which is this house here. And my parents had looked at Merrifield House before as an option, and it was going to be demolished, so they hadn't pursued it. And they said, well, we can't buy Merrifield House because they're going to demolish it. It had 12 acres of grounds, and they were going to build a big housing estate. And the guy who they were talking to said, well, you can't, they can't knock down Merrifield House anymore because it's now listed. It's been protected. So the 12 acres is still going to be used for housing, but the house, which was in a 3/4 of an acre or so, that has to stay. So they wrote to the developers and said, we'd like to buy that house, please, for Christian purposes. That's literally what they said. And they heard nothing more for ages. And then one day my dad felt prompted to call them and say, basically, no, we haven't heard from you, what's going on? And the guy said, have you got inside information? And he said, what do you mean? He said, well, we've literally just decided this morning that we're going to sell it. And if you want it, come and see us. Come and make an appointment. So my dad went to the appointment with someone else who they were going to live in community with. And the guy said, you're going to use this house for what you call Christian purposes. What does that mean? Because, and I should find the quote here, he said, I'm going to be building a development of quality homes. I'm not going to sell the house to you if people like drug addicts or ex-prisoners would be going to be there, or if people would be coming and going all hours of the day and night. And of course, that's not the kind of promise my parents could make, because this was exactly the type of thing that they had in mind. So brilliantly, my dad, you know, there's that bit in the New Testament where they talk about, if you don't know what to say, the Spirit will inspire you in the moment, and you'll have answers to questions. So my dad answers this. He said, "Well, Mr. Birch, I think we can assure you that we don't intend to do anything different in Merrifield to what we're doing in our own homes at the present time." The guy responds, "Okay, that's fine, let's talk money." Forgot to ask them exactly what they were doing in their home at that particular time. So the doors are opening. So this is the early 70s when money was worth a bit more than it is today. So the purchase price for this building was £28,500. And they needed another £1,500 to do the heating and all the other stuff that needed to be done. So £30,000 is what they needed. And they were living in community, so the idea was they just chuck everything into a pot and see how much money there is there. So my parents had 6,000, they put that in. The other couple had 6,000, they put that in. 12,000. Still a long way short. A friend of theirs gave them 2,000, so they're up to 14,000. A friend gave them 4,000 interest-free loan, 18,000, so they're still 12,000 short. They go to 16 banks, none of them would lend them the money. And they're getting to the point where obviously you go to exchange of contracts and you put down a deposit, and their solicitor wrote to them, and my dad quotes it in here, the solicitor wrote to them and said, "I cannot advise you to go ahead with this purchase because you haven't got the funds in place. And if you can't complete, you'll lose your money." But they had this sense of vision, they had this sense of purpose, and they said, "Okay, we're going to crack on. No, I think God's in this, so we're going to go ahead with this." And they're getting to the point where it's getting pretty tight, what they would call in football, squeaky bum time, where they're just, they're on the edge. They have to get to completion. They haven't got the money. One of the people in their group gets a phone call a couple of weeks out. "Hi," someone they'd never spoken to before, never met. "Hi, I heard about your venture. Just want to know a bit more about it." So this lady started setting out the vision of what they were planning to do and all the rest of it. And she said, no, not that. How much money do you need? What's the financial situation? And they said, "Well, we need a loan or a mortgage for £12,000. She said, "Yeah, that should be fine. I'll come back to you in a couple of days." And came back to them in a couple of days, and all the money came in, and they completed the purchase, and they lived in this house. I mean, it's enormous. The living room could seat 70 people. It was really huge. And the book is full of all kinds of stories of things, like almost like Feeding of the 5,000 type stories and various other things that happened when they were in that house. So, purpose of that story, talking about holding on to a sense of purpose, taking risks, and seeing it through, where you've got that sense of God having spoken to you and that sense of God being in it. What next? Finding perspective George told me brilliantly earlier, this takes time to warm up again if you don't use it for a while. So finding perspective, and maintaining perspective. So I've put this in red, which is unfortunate because you can't now read it, but I'll read it out to you. The interesting thing here is you've got one verse which is like disaster, another verse which is also disaster, and in the middle of it, this great statement of faith and hope and trust. So it says in verse 4, I lie down among lions that greedily devour human prey. Their teeth are spears and arrows, their tongues sharp swords. And then verse 5, be exalted, O God, above the heavens, let your glory be over all the earth. And then back into 6, they set a net for my steps. My soul was bowed down. They dug a pit in my path, but they've fallen into it themselves. So somehow, in the middle of all of this terrible stuff that he can write out in the psalm, in the middle of it, he finds this expression of hope. He finds this expression of perspective, of knowing where God sits in the perspective of an incredibly real, physical, personal situation, and he turns his eyes heavenward in the middle of it. And so I was thinking in this context, how do we find that perspective? And I think for all of us, it can be different, the way that we bring ourselves back to that perspective. And I think that this is from a very well-known book, Celebration of Discipline, about Christian spirituality, written in the 70s. But this guy, Richard Foster, brought together lots of different spiritual disciplines that he didn't make up. He was gathering together wisdom from the ages. But I think for David in this context, it's worship and prayer are things which help bring perspective and bring him back to this centering kind of place. And that's what the Psalms are, really, at their heart. I have to say, for me, very often it's solitude. That's how I find re-find my sense of perspective when life's busy and there's lots of things going on and not everything seems to be going perfectly right. Sometimes I just have to try and turn down the volume, and in our house that is both literal and metaphorical at times. But the ability to just retreat and find some space and time, and that is what helps me kind of regain this sense of perspective. But that's not the same for everyone. There may be things on here which help people regain perspective. It may be something else. But I think it's important that whatever it is that works for us and however we are particularly wired, that we retreat to those places or to doing these particular things, which enables us to re-find perspective, as David did in circumstances where, as we've seen, people were literally trying to kill him and hunt him down. And then the final thing is this last bit, which I've called pull yourself together. And as I say, this isn't the solution to every problem, but sometimes there is an aspect of just rousing yourself. And this is the last 7 verses. So it says, my heart, O God, is steadfast. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. Awake, my soul. Awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the peoples. For great is your love, reaching to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. And this sense where he's just getting himself together. He talks about his heart twice in the first 2 lines. He talks about awaking his soul twice in the first 2 lines of 8. He talks about being steadfast. He's reaffirming to himself truths which are keeping him together, and giving himself this kind of focus. And it reminded me, actually, when I was thinking about this, of a course I did with the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity, the LICC, if people have come across them. And one lady on that course was talking about something called neuroplasticity. Has anyone heard of neuroplasticity? Yeah? This idea that the way you think and the way that you operate and the way that your brain works is not fixed forever. You can actually rewire your neural pathways. You can rewire the way you think and the way that you operate. And sometimes, you hear these things and it makes sense of stuff that you kind of instinctively know, or that we see David doing in the Psalms. And I think there is because our brains are agile and can adapt and can grow, this is another way of the way that God works through our intensely normal, physical, everyday life, I think. And how, when we're focusing on things like David is focusing on at the end of this chapter, we can reform and rewire the way that we think and the way that we approach situations. And it's such a good discipline, and it's such a good thing for us to get into, where our immediate reaction to situations is not then necessarily negative, or not necessarily taking us in a particular kind of disaster zone direction, but that we're thinking much more, hold on a second, I'm going to praise you, O Lord, among the nations. My heart is steadfast. I can do this. I can hold on to you. And so our natural reactions to situations become very different because of the way that we can spiritually train our brains to think and train the way that we might operate. So as I say, it's just one of those things I think which kind of makes sense of something we might instinctively know already, but that God can change us, and also our habits and our spiritual habits are ways that actually can physically change the way that our brains operate and the way that we function in life. So those were my 4 things, and I think we're going to shortly go into a song where we can reflect on these. And they're not. It's not that all of these things will be relevant to everyone all of the time, but it may be that there are 1 or 2 that you look at and say, actually, I could do with that now, or that's something I want to make a habit. That's something that I want to, make deep in my being, so it drives the way that I think and the way that I do things. The first thing was refuge and protection. Remember that mother hen with the wings, and sometimes you just think it's all going wrong and there's a storm coming from above. God, I just need you to shelter me. Or maybe God's calling some other member of our church family to help us alongside and provide that measure of protection and refuge at certain times. The sense of holding on to purpose, that there's, if God's called us to something, and we've got this maybe it's a prophetic word or something else which has come into our lives, and in my parents' case it involved taking quite a lot of risk and putting literally everything on the line. They could have lost everything in that particular story that they had, but that sense of holding on to purpose, as David did, knowing what his purpose was. Third thing, finding perspective and maintaining perspective, I would say, because I find perspective and lose it again. I don't know if anyone else is like that. And that's why I need to retreat into solitude to refine perspective. And maybe for other people it's going to prayer, or it's going to worship, or it's going to any of the other spiritual disciplines. And then maybe sometimes there is an aspect to which we just have to get ourselves going, and there is not always, but sometimes that's the answer to the question. And maybe there's the same passage we should read every day for a month till it's so heavily and deeply ingrained in us that our brain is rewired to actually think in those ways and have that truth inside us. And I think all of these, to some extent, are some manifestation of the prophetic word that Eve had and what Jane was talking about earlier, in terms of, going back into God holding us, but also being able to trust Him with our purpose, trust Him that He is the ultimate perspective in all of this, and He is the one that will protect us if we let go of the rope. And it's all about, to a certain extent, just making room for Him to do these things in our lives, and holding on to the promises, holding on to the things that we were talking about. So we'll pray just quickly, and then we'll move into a song.